Every day, Denise let herself in with the same house key her son had given her years ago. This morning, while her daughter-in-law was out running errands, Denise called a locksmith and changed every lock in the house. She wanted her son's wife locked out for good, but she never noticed the small doorbell camera watching her the entire time. Before we get started, if stories like this hit close to home for you, take a moment to press that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight. It genuinely helps stories like this find the people who need them most. Now let's begin, because what happened at Emily's front door this Tuesday morning had been quietly building for almost 4 years. Emily had married Daniel 4 years earlier, moving into the small brick house his grandparents had left him, a house that needed a lot of work when they first bought it together. Daniel's mother, Denise, had helped them move in that very first week, carrying boxes, hanging curtains, even keeping a spare key for emergencies, since she only lived 15 minutes away. At the time, Emily had been grateful for the help, touched even, believing it was simply what a close family did for each other. She had no idea that spare key would still be sitting in Denise's purse 4 years later, or how much it would come to matter one ordinary Tuesday morning. Denise had never been openly cruel to Emily, not in any way anyone outside the family would have noticed. She was warm in front of others, always offering a hug at the door, always complimenting Emily's cooking at holiday dinners. But underneath that warmth sat something Emily had learned to recognize slowly over the years. A quiet unwillingness to fully let go of the life she'd built around her only son before Emily ever came into the picture. Denise dropped by often, sometimes without calling first, letting herself in through the front door the same way she had for years, rearranging small things in the kitchen, watering plants that didn't need watering, small reminders, whether she meant them that way or not, that this house had once belonged fully to her side of the family. Daniel rarely noticed any tension in these visits. He loved his mother deeply, and he saw her frequent visits as simple closeness, nothing more complicated than a mother who missed spending time with her only child. Whenever Emily gently mentioned feeling like she had no privacy in her own home, Daniel would tell her she was overreacting, that his mother meant well, that she'd always been involved and probably always would be. Emily stopped bringing it up after a while, not because it stopped bothering her, but because she didn't want small tension with Denise to grow into something bigger between her and Daniel. She told herself Denise simply needed time to adjust to sharing her son. What Emily did not yet understand was that Denise had never actually planned on adjusting at all. Small comments had crept into conversations over the years, easy to dismiss individually, harder to ignore once Emily finally started noticing the pattern. Denise once mentioned, almost wistfully, how Daniel's college girlfriend Rebecca had always kept such a beautifully organized home. She brought it up again months later, then again around Christmas. The same quiet comparison dressed up slightly differently each time. Denise had also, more than once, told Daniel in front of Emily that she hoped he hadn't rushed into marriage too quickly, always framing it as simple motherly concern rather than anything sharper. Emily absorbed these moments quietly, choosing peace over conflict, the way she had chosen it for 4 straight years. This particular Tuesday started like any other. Daniel left early for work, kissing Emily goodbye at the door, reminding her not to forget the dry cleaning on her way to the grocery store. Emily had a full list of errands planned, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that usually passed without a single memorable moment. She grabbed her purse, double-checked she had her keys, and backed out of the driveway around 9, waving briefly to a neighbor watering her garden, having absolutely no idea that just 15 minutes away, Denise had already picked up her phone and started dialing a number she'd found online the night before. Denise sat at her own kitchen table that morning, staring at her phone for a long moment before finally making the call, something in her chest tight and uncertain, though her voice, when the locksmith finally answered, came out calm and steady. She gave the address without hesitation, the same address she'd helped move boxes into 4 years earlier, the same house she still, in her own quiet way, considered partly hers. She told herself this wasn't anything drastic, simply a small precaution after hearing about a break-in 2 streets over, something any concerned mother might reasonably do for her son's safety. She had absolutely no idea, hanging up the phone and grabbing her car keys, that the small doorbell camera Daniel had installed just weeks earlier was about to capture every single thing she was planning to do next. Denise arrived at the house a little before 10, parking her car a few doors down instead of directly in the driveway, a small detail she barely noticed herself doing until much later, when it would matter far more than she ever expected. She let herself in through the front door with her spare key one final time, walking through rooms that still felt, in some quiet corner of her mind, like they belonged partly to her. She glanced at the family photos lining the hallway, Emily and Daniel smiling together at their wedding, and something tightened in her chest that she didn't fully want to examine too closely. The locksmith arrived almost exactly on time, a younger man with a friendly, easy manner who asked no real questions beyond confirming the address and getting Denise's signature on a simple work order. Denise explained, smoothly and without hesitation, that her son had asked her to handle this while he and his wife were both busy at work, a small lie that came easier to her than she expected it to. The locksmith nodded, clearly used to homeowners handling things exactly this way, and got to work removing the old locks from both the front and back doors without a second thought about who actually owned the house. What neither of them noticed, standing there in the bright morning sunlight, was the small doorbell camera mounted just above the front door frame, its lens quietly capturing everything happening on that porch in clear, steady detail. Daniel had installed it only 3 weeks earlier, mostly as a convenience for accepting packages while they were both at work, never once imagining it might end up recording something far more significant than a delivery truck pulling into the driveway. The camera's small light blinked steadily, unnoticed, while Denise stood just a few feet away, watching the old locks come off one by one. The entire job took just under an hour, the locksmith working efficiently through both doors while Denise waited nearby, occasionally glancing at her phone, occasionally glancing down the street toward the direction Emily's car usually came from. When he finally finished, he handed her 2 sets of shining new keys, along with a receipt she folded carefully and tucked into her purse without looking at it twice. She thanked him, walked him back to his van, and stood in the driveway for a moment afterward, turning the new keys over in her hand, telling herself once again that this was simply about safety, nothing more complicated than that. Denise let herself back into the house, one final time, using the brand new key, moving quietly through the kitchen, setting a spare set on the counter for Daniel, tucking the other set safely into her own purse, without a second thought about what that particular choice actually meant. She glanced at the clock on the stove, noting it was nearly 11, and felt a small flicker of something uneasy settle into her stomach, though she pushed it aside quickly, telling herself there was still plenty of time before Emily usually returned from her Tuesday errands. She left the house a few minutes later, pulling out of her parking spot down the street, just as another car turned the corner 2 blocks away, close enough that a more careful person might have noticed, though Denise, focused entirely on getting home before anyone asked questions, didn't glance in her rearview mirror even once. If you've ever felt like your own home wasn't quite fully yours because of someone else's quiet interference, tell me in the comments below. And if you've ever made a decision you told yourself was reasonable, only to feel that same decision sit heavier and heavier the longer you sat with it, don't be afraid to share that here too, because sometimes we understand our own actions a lot more clearly once someone else finally sees them for what they really were. Emily pulled into her driveway a little after noon, arms full of grocery bags, completely unaware that anything about her ordinary Tuesday had changed at all, humming quietly to herself as she balanced her keys between 2 fingers and walked toward a front door that was about to feel like a complete stranger's house for the very first time. Emily shifted the grocery bags carefully onto one arm, fishing her key out of her pocket with the other hand, the same easy motion she'd done 1,000 times before without ever once thinking about it. She slid the key into the lock and turned it, expecting the familiar click that always led her back into her own home. Instead, the key simply refused to turn at all, catching awkwardly in a lock that suddenly felt entirely unfamiliar. She frowned, pulled it out, checked it was actually the right key, and tried again, twisting it a little harder this time, though the result stayed exactly the same. A small knot of confusion began forming in her stomach as she stepped back and looked at the door more carefully, noticing for the first time the faint scratches around the lock's edge, the kind of marks that appear when new hardware gets installed. She set the grocery bags down gently on the porch, her heart beginning to beat a little faster now, and tried the back door instead, hurrying around the side of the house with a growing sense of unease she couldn't quite explain yet. The back door didn't open either, the same unfamiliar resistance meeting her key exactly the way the front door had. Emily pulled out her phone with slightly unsteady hands and called Daniel, standing on her own back porch, like a stranger, locked out of a house she'd lived in for 4 years. "Daniel, something's wrong. My key isn't working. Neither door will open," she said, her voice carrying a thin edge of panic she couldn't quite smooth away. Daniel, still at work, sounded genuinely confused on the other end of the line, promising he'd leave immediately, though his voice carried none of the answers Emily desperately needed in that exact moment. She sat down slowly on the porch steps, her groceries melting slightly in the warm afternoon sun beside her, replaying the morning over and over, trying to understand what could have possibly changed since she'd left the house just a few hours earlier. A car pulled into the driveway 10 minutes later, and Emily's relief at seeing a familiar vehicle turned quickly into confusion when she realized it was Denise stepping out, not Daniel. "Oh, sweetheart, is everything all right?" Denise asked, her voice carrying a practiced concern that didn't quite match the calm, unhurried way she walked up the driveway. Emily explained quickly, still confused herself, that neither of her keys seemed to work anymore, that something about both locks felt completely different. Denise's expression shifted into something carefully sympathetic, though something underneath it felt, to Emily, slightly too rehearsed to be entirely genuine. "How strange," Denise said smoothly. "I heard there was a break-in scare 2 streets over last week. Maybe Daniel had the locks changed and simply forgot to mention it to you." Emily wanted to believe that explanation, wanted badly for there to be a simple, forgetful reason behind all of this rather than something more troubling, but a small, uneasy feeling kept nagging at the back of her mind, a feeling she couldn't quite name yet. "That seems like something he would have told me," Emily said carefully, watching Denise's face for any small reaction. Denise simply shrugged lightly, glancing toward the street as though checking for Daniel's car, offering nothing further beyond her original explanation, though her hands, Emily noticed now, were gripping her own purse strap just a little too tightly for someone who claimed to know nothing about what had actually happened. Daniel's car turned into the driveway a few minutes later, and Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her at finally seeing him, though that relief faded quickly the moment she noticed the confused, searching look on his face as he stepped out and studied both his wife and his mother standing together near the front door. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between them, sensing immediately that something about this entire moment felt off in a way he couldn't yet fully explain. Denise repeated her earlier explanation smoothly. The break-in scare, the assumption that Daniel must have arranged this himself, her voice calm and steady in a way that almost worked completely, almost convinced him entirely. But something in Daniel's expression shifted slightly as he studied his mother's face a little too closely, a small flicker of doubt crossing behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment earlier. He hadn't called any locksmith. He hadn't heard anything about a break-in 2 streets over. And standing there in his own driveway, watching his mother's explanation not quite line up with anything he actually knew to be true, Daniel reached slowly into his pocket for his phone, remembering suddenly, with a small jolt of unease, the doorbell camera he'd installed only weeks earlier, an app he hadn't thought to check even once all morning. Daniel opened the doorbell app slowly, his thumb hovering over the notification history from that morning, a small knot tightening in his stomach as he scrolled back to 9:45. Right around the time his mother claimed to know nothing about any of this. Emily watched him closely, her arms still wrapped around herself against the afternoon chill, while Denise stood a few feet away, glancing occasionally toward her own car, as though she were already thinking about how quickly she might be able to leave. Daniel found the clip he was looking for and pressed play, angling the phone away from both women at first, needing just one moment alone to understand exactly what he was about to see. The footage was unmistakable, clear and steady in the morning light. It showed Denise walking up to the front door, letting herself in with her own spare key, then standing patiently on the porch while a locksmith worked methodically through both the front and back doors. It showed her signing something on his clipboard, thanking him, and pocketing a fresh set of keys before locking up and driving away, all without a single phone call to Daniel, all while Emily was 15 minutes away, completely unaware her own home was being sealed off behind her. Daniel watched it twice, his jaw tightening a little more with each replay, before he finally looked up from the screen toward his mother. "You called a locksmith," he said slowly, his voice quieter than Emily had ever heard it, though something underneath it carried a weight that made both women go completely still. "You had every lock in our house changed while Emily was out running errands." Denise's face drained slightly, the practiced calm from a few minutes earlier beginning to crack at the edges now that the truth was sitting plainly in her son's hand. "Daniel, I can explain," she started, though her voice had lost the smooth confidence it carried just moments ago. "I only wanted to make sure this house was safe. I've always helped take care of things here." "This isn't your house to take care of anymore, Mom," Daniel said, each word landing slowly, deliberately, carrying none of the hesitation he usually brought into conversations with his mother. "This is Emily's home, too. You locked her out of her own house without telling either of us, and then you stood here and let us both believe there was some innocent explanation for it." Denise opened her mouth again, searching for something that might soften what the footage had already made completely undeniable, but nothing she offered this time carried the same easy authority it always had before. Emily stood quietly beside Daniel, watching this unfold, feeling something inside her finally settle after 4 long years of small, dismissed doubts, suddenly validated all at once by a few seconds of doorbell footage. She didn't say much, didn't need to, understanding that Daniel finally seeing this clearly, in his mother's own actions rather than through Emily's careful, hesitant complaints, mattered more than anything she could have said herself. Denise glanced toward her, something flickering across her face that looked almost like genuine shame, though she still hadn't fully found the words to offer any real apology. "I need you to give me that spare key," Daniel said finally, holding out his hand toward his mother, his voice steady and calm, despite everything. "Not because I don't love you, but because this has to stop. Emily deserves to feel safe in her own home, without wondering what might happen while she's out running simple errands." Denise reached slowly into her purse, pulling out the extra key she'd tucked away just hours earlier, placing it carefully into her son's open palm, without another word of protest, understanding, finally, that the quiet control she'd held onto for 4 years had just ended completely in her own son's driveway. The weeks that followed brought real, if imperfect, change. Denise still called, still visited occasionally, though always now with a phone call first, always waiting for an actual invitation, rather than simply letting herself in the way she once had. She never fully explained why 4 years of quiet resentment had built up to something this deliberate, though she did, eventually, admit to Emily directly that she'd never truly learned how to let her son build a life that wasn't centered entirely around her anymore. Emily didn't rush toward full forgiveness, though she found herself, months later, finally feeling something she hadn't felt in years, standing at her own front door, safe and completely, unquestionably home. If this story reminded you that real love sometimes means finally setting the boundaries that should have existed all along, do me a small favor and subscribe before you go, so you never miss the next story like this one.